There were giggles. There's, whenever you're not sure about something like this, like it's easy to, make a joke and, you know, find something out of the ordinary. Very funny. But we cleaned up and we went home. This story for me begins in spring of 2020. I was 24, about to be 24, and I was working in Norfolk at a restaurant downtown, an Irish pub to be exact. It was around February that we had started to receive reports of concerns of COVID-19 starting to make its way to other countries, specifically the United States. And there were brewings of lockdowns, there were brewings of quarantines, and there was really no amount of solid information. It was day after day of news reports of, fear mongering and speculation and just concern, just the concern that you see in mass produced from a real place of fear, but, utilized to hype that up. By the time March rolled around, tensions were pretty high everywhere. And like I said, I was working at an Irish pub. It was our biggest day of the year, St. Patty's Day, when around 8 p.m. we had a group of police come around to our fully packed restaurant to inform us that we had stayed open 2 hours past the officially mandated lockdown that had just gone countrywide. Everyone just kind of stood around for a few minutes before my owner stepped out and made an announcement to the entirety of the 150, 200 people there that everyone had to go home. And we were done and we were in lockdown. And all the guests left and we just kind of so quietly cleaned up. There were giggles. There's, whenever you're not sure about something like this, like it's easy to, make a joke and, you know, find something out of the ordinary. Very funny. But we cleaned up and we went home. I was going home with my boyfriend at the time, and he had a lot of concerns pretty much out the gate, not so much about the disease itself, but about the people and how they were going to react to this. So we decided that it made a lot of sense for me to pack a bag and go stay with him in case, something drastic had to happen and we had to leave. There were so many talks about this, borderline being world ending, of course, by like extreme measures, but there was just a lot of uncertainty, and it was, safer to be together than not. So I packed up a bag for a couple weeks and I went over to his and his roommate's house where I stayed. He had an outside job at the time. He worked in construction. So he was gone during the days because they were just still working during lockdown. It was pretty common for Virginia Beach companies. There wasn't a lot of, even in the very beginning, there was not a lot of regulation done. And if you could get away with it, a lot of companies were doing work. Restaurants, of course, couldn't, there was no way. We were completely shut down at first. So I just kind of sat around doing nothing, feeling very, very listless. The world was shut down. I had nothing to do besides bide my time. I was running in circles, like an animal in an enclosure with nothing in it, and started to drive me nuts. And I was just building this like narrative of anxiety and concern and having nothing but a singular person to tie me down. I immediately went and I filled out all the paperwork for unemployment because obviously the immediate concern was, well, how am I going to survive this, monetarily? It was just concern and nothingness. That was all it was at first. It was fear and nothingness. And there was no way to get any answers. I think it led me to a place that was really close to other depressive episodes that I've had. That was hard. It then started to shift. My then boyfriend's roommate didn't really believe any of it, expressed a concern with me being at the house. And so I got my stuff together and I went back home. At this point, I had started to receive payments from the programs that had gone into place pretty quickly. I was receiving a weekly income that was very easy to maintain because there was nothing going on. And I went home and I started to feel more comfortable there. The first couple weeks, after the first couple weeks, things, I don't want to say settled out, but at least people were communicating again because it felt like there was nothing to talk about, no one to talk to at first, but it felt like people started reaching out at that point and talking to each other. So a couple weeks after that, I started to, I don't want to say relax, but I did. There was a routine that started to develop out of that. I woke up, I made my coffee, I did a little workout, and I started to realize that I didn't have anything planned to do with my day. I like doing things. So I started to find things that I could do by myself or in, you know, tight quarantine spaces, people I lived with. What came out of that was, through my breakfast and through my food, I started to build like little boards. From building like cheese boards and food boards, I started to get interested in like how things were made. My best friend had at the same time started really getting into like fermenting and canning and food experiments herself. I started to really get into like making cheese. I learned how to make cheese. I ordered a bunch of products offline from some website of a Wisconsin cheesemonger. I taught myself, and it was just the coolest thing. From there, I started to, look around and realize that I really, really wanted to be outside. It was easy to keep social distance when you were outside away from people. And so I started spending a lot of time outside, and it was nice and it was beautiful. It was spring and there was nothing to do. So I took the shoddy little shadow box that we had at the front of our apartment complex that hadn't been touched in what appeared to be centuries. And I started a little garden because I wanted to have more things to use on my boards. I went and got a few herbs and I learned how to care for them. And I learned how to dehydrate them to have my own spices. And it just brought so much joy. And I just started to do little things like that. I started to find hobbies that I knew I had adjacent interests in, but I didn't have time to explore them. With my best friend, when we were, able to see each other, we just went and spent time outside and did things and picked flowers and walked around and hung out. We had so much space and so much time that felt so removed from what reality was. What existing in this day and age is, there was more time than I knew what to do with, and it was so soothing in a lot of ways. There was the daily like upkeep of keeping, a pulse on the workings of the world, making sure that everyone stayed safe and doing what you could. It was really so freeing to have this time in this space that just doesn't really exist anymore. I took a lot of that time with me. I learned that that was the thing that I wanted to seek in life. I wanted that time and I wanted that space. So when things started to go back to normal, I started working 1 day a week and then 3 days a week. Then we switched from just doing to-go food to letting people back in the restaurant to allowing people, to fill up tables as long as they were 6 feet apart again to you working full time. When that reality came back after a few months, I was a different person and I approached it differently. It was a means to an end now, not just how I had to live and figure out how to find joy in that. I had learned a new way of living and I realized that I could find ways to get back to that. And so everything I do now is to get that time and that space to find joy. And it was a terrible, and it was a horrible time for so many. And there is never any negation of the suffering that that time in our world caused. They give a lot of perspective to our mortality and my mortality and the limited amount of time and space we have to make joy in our lives. And so I just work towards that every day now. All I want is to hang out with my friends in a field and make cheese.